was a Saturday night in October, warm air, laughter, and the kind of stillness that only small towns know. In the woods outside Pinson, Alabama, the glow of a bonfire painted the trees orange. Dozens of young people stood around it talking, dancing, sharing stories. For them, it was just another weekend escape. But in less than an hour, that laughter would be replaced by screams. Among them was an 18-year-old girl, a senior cheerleader named Kimber Mills. She had just celebrated her last homecoming, was counting down the days to graduation, and dreaming about college, about life beyond Cleveland High. To her family, she was sunshine, the daughter who could never stay mad, the friend who never stopped smiling. The bonfire spot they called the pit was supposed to be safe, hidden among tall pines, miles from the main road, a quiet clearing where teenagers had gathered for years. Music echoed through truck speakers. Phone flashlights cut through the dark. Nothing about that night felt unusual, until it did. Around 11 p.m., a sound broke through the noise, a sound no one there would ever forget. One moment, Kimber was standing near her friends. The next, panic, confusion, and the unmistakable echo of gunfire. When the dust settled, 4 people were on the ground. The chaos that followed blurred into sirens, shouting, headlights moving across the field. Within minutes, paramedics were racing down a dirt road toward the woods. Kimber Mills was among the wounded, unresponsive, gravely hurt. She would be airlifted to Birmingham that night. By sunrise, news of the shooting had spread across Blount County. Parents called their children in tears, classmates gathered in disbelief, and officers began piecing together what had really happened at the pit. It was a story that would shake the heart of Alabama, not because of who Kimber was, but because of how quickly a life so bright could be taken away. This is her story. The story of Kimber Mills, the girl who was just 18, and the night that changed everything. In Cleveland, Alabama, life moves at a slower rhythm. The kind of place where the diner waitress knows your order and the Friday night lights are more than a game, they're a gathering of the whole town. At the center of it all was Kimber Mills. She wasn't famous, she wasn't the kind of girl who tried to stand out, but somehow she always did. Born and raised right here in Blount County, Kimber had that rare mix of grace and grit. On the cheer squad, she was the one holding others steady in every lift, smiling even when routines went wrong. Her teammates said she made pressure feel like peace. Teachers described her as determined, respectful, a student who asked questions not to impress, but to understand. She wanted to study nursing, maybe pediatrics. "I just want to help people," she once told a friend after practice. Simple words, but they carried more meaning than anyone could have known. Her bedroom walls were covered in pastel ribbons and Polaroids, football games, birthdays, lake trips. In almost every picture, she was in the middle, laughing. To her parents, she was still their little girl who left notes on the kitchen counter, the one who'd sneak extra treats to the family dog, the daughter who said, "I love you," every time she walked out the door. At 18, Kimber was on the edge of everything: good adulthood, independence, the life she'd imagined beyond the small-town limits. That Saturday, October 19th, started like any other. She slept in, went to brunch with friends, then spent the afternoon helping her younger brother with homework. There was nothing unusual, nothing to foreshadow what was coming. When evening rolled around, her phone buzzed a group chat, a bonfire at the pit. Nothing new, nothing risky, just music, laughter, and a chance to unwind before another school week. She told her mom, Don't worry, I won't be late." It was the last promise she ever made. That night, Kimber got ready like she always did: pink hoodie, jeans, sneakers, dusted from last week's game. She brushed her hair, checked her reflection, and smiled at the mirror. Outside, her friends honked from the driveway. Kimber grabbed her phone, called out, "Love you," and ran toward the car. Her mother remembers the echo of that door closing. For her family, it's a sound that still plays in their minds. Because a few hours later, silence would replace it, a silence no parent should ever know. By 9 p.m., the convoy of trucks and cars had made its way down the dirt road toward the clearing they called the pit. The flames rose high against the night sky, country music spilling from speakers. For a while, it was perfect laughter, selfies, the kind of joy that feels endless when you're young. Kimber danced with friends, teased them about Monday's practice, and took one last photo, a blur of firelight, her smile glowing in the dark. It would be the final image of her alive. Somewhere on the edge of that crowd, arguments started, voices too loud, faces unfamiliar. A few tried to ignore it. Others felt the tension rise, but thought it would pass. No one knew that among those strangers stood a man who'd been drinking, who carried a gun, and whose anger would soon tear through the night. For Kimber Mills, that October evening had begun like any other. But before the clock struck midnight, it would become the night her small town would never forget. By the time Kimber and her friends pulled up, the clearing everyone called the pit was already alive. A ring of pickup trucks circled a roaring fire. The smell of smoke and pine mixed with spilled beer. Music thumped from a Bluetooth speaker balanced on a tailgate. Voices overlapped inside jokes, small-town gossip, and the kind of laughter that carried through the trees. It wasn't a secret gathering. Bonfires like this happened almost every weekend, out of sight from parents, out of mind from town. The woods near Pinson had always been a kind of in-between space. Freedom, danger, and youth all tangled together. Kimber moved easily through the crowd, greeting friends from school, hugging teammates, snapping photos. In every clip that surfaced later, she looks relaxed, no hint of fear, no sense that the night was about to shift. Around the edges of the firelight, a different crowd gathered. Older faces, a few strangers. Some had been drinking heavily. Arguments sparked over nothing, a spilled drink, a careless word. Witnesses would later say the energy changed, sharp and uncomfortable. At 10:45 p.m., the music paused. Someone shouted. A phone dropped into the dirt. The argument grew louder, two men pushing, circling. People started backing away. Kimber stood several feet back, watching, her arms crossed, expression uncertain. Friends tried to pull others toward their cars, but curiosity kept some frozen. Then, in the confusion, a flash. A single loud crack split the night. For a second, no one moved. Then chaos. Shouts turned to screams. Someone yelled, "He's got a gun!" Another flash and another. 4 people fell. Cell phone lights jerked wildly as people scattered toward the tree line. Tires spun on gravel. Music still played, a strange echo against the panic. Kimber's friends dropped beside her, realizing she wasn't getting up. She'd been hit. They called her name again and again, waiting for a response that didn't come. 911 calls flooded dispatch within minutes. The first responders would later describe the drive-in. A narrow dirt road, lit only by emergency lights. A haze of smoke and dust rising through the trees. Paramedics reached Kimber around 11:12 p.m. Her pulse was weak. She was still breathing barely. They worked fast, stabilizing her, radioing ahead for a helicopter. As they lifted her onto the stretcher, one of the medics whispered, "Stay with me, sweetheart. Stay with me." The sound of rotors filled the clearing. The helicopter hovered above, blades chopping the smoke into rings of orange light. Friends stood back, crying, holding each other. In those few minutes, the bonfire that had been a celebration became a crime scene. Shell casings glinted in the dirt. Half-empty cups still steamed in the firelight. A single cheer bough lay near the edge of the field. Kimber was flown to the University of Alabama at Birmingham Hospital. The others were treated on site, wounded, shaken, but alive. Police taped off the area, interviewing anyone who hadn't fled. The same name came up again and again: Stephen Tyler Whitehead. He was 27, known around town, not a stranger, not a ghost. Just another face people had seen at bars, at gas stations, at gatherings like this one. Officers began the search immediately. Within hours, they had him in custody. The official report would later list the charges as attempted murder. But by sunrise, detectives knew the truth. One of their victims might not survive the night, and as dawn broke over the woods, smoke still rising from the dying fire, the first headlines appeared: 4 shot at Alabama bonfire. For most readers, it was another tragedy in a line of senseless violence. For the town of Cleveland, it was the start of the longest week they would ever live. The flight from Pinson to Birmingham lasted less than 20 minutes, but for those waiting, it felt endless. Inside the helicopter, paramedics fought to keep Kimber's heartbeat steady. Oxygen mask secure, IV running, numbers flickering on the monitor. One medic later said she kept whispering Kimber's name, not out of protocol, but out of instinct. "Sometimes they can still hear you," she said. At 11:42 p.m., the helicopter touched down on the rooftop of UAB Hospital. Trauma teams were already waiting. The doors slid open to fluorescent light and controlled chaos, doctors shouting vitals, nurses moving in unison, the sound of rubber soles and stainless steel trays. Kimber's parents were still in Cleveland when the call came. It was after midnight. Her mother remembers the words, "There's been a shooting. Your daughter's hurt." No parent is ever prepared for that sentence. They drove through the night 40 miles that felt like a lifetime. Her father said every red light looked longer, every mile sign crueler. When they reached the hospital, a nurse met them at the door. She didn't have to speak. The look in her eyes said enough. Kimber was in surgery. The bullet had caused catastrophic internal damage. For hours, surgeons worked transfusions, sutures, machines breathing for her. Outside the glass, family and friends filled the hallway. Cheer uniforms still on, mascara streaked, hands clasped. They prayed, they waited. Word spread quickly through town. By sunrise, vigils had started forming at the high school parking lot. Students lit candles, teachers stood in silence, pink ribbons appeared on car mirrors and front porches. Inside the ICU, the hum of machines marked time. Kimber's pulse, faint, irregular, echoed through the room. Doctors explained the swelling on her brain, the risks, the uncertainty. Her parents held her hand, whispering childhood nicknames, stories. Anything that might reach whatever part of her was still listening. For the next 48 hours, the hospital became a crossroads of hope and grief. Strangers donated meals. Churches sent flowers. Local news crews waited outside. Reporters said they had never seen a small community rally so quickly. But medicine can only do so much. By Tuesday morning, the doctors gathered the family. They spoke softly, carefully, explaining that her injuries were irreversible. Machines were keeping her alive, but Kimber herself was gone. Her mother said later that she felt the air leave the room. For a long time, no one spoke. And then through tears, her parents made a decision, one that would turn unspeakable loss into something larger than death. Kimber would become an organ donor. Her heart was strong, her lungs, her kidneys, all still capable of saving lives. That afternoon, hospital staff prepared what's known as an honor walk. Nurses lined the corridor, hands clasped, heads bowed. As Kimber's stretcher moved past, the hall fell silent except for the soft roll of wheels and the rhythm of her monitor. Outside the hospital, the crowd, watching through glass, began to cry, not from the tragedy alone, but from the grace within it. Kimber's final journey wasn't marked by fear or confusion. It was marked by love, by sacrifice, by a quiet kind of courage that outlives the moment it's born. That same evening, surgeons completed the donations. Her heart was flown to a children's hospital hundreds of miles away. Doctors would later say it went to a 7-year-old who'd been waiting months for a match. In death, Kimber did what she had always wanted to do, help people. And as the sun set over Birmingham, pink light spilling across the city skyline, her parents stood outside the hospital doors, hands intertwined. They said she came into this world loved, and she would leave it the same way. While doctors fought to save Kimber's life, investigators were working in the background, piecing together what had really happened at the pit. Within hours of the shooting, deputies from Jefferson County had sealed off the clearing. Empty beer cans, shell casings, tire marks, all frozen in photographs before daylight could erase them. The scene looked almost unreal. A ring of cars, a smoldering fire, and 4 small markers where blood had darkened the ground. Witness statements came in waves. Dozens of teenagers, some too shaken to speak, others contradicting one another. But one name appeared again and again. Stephen Tyler Whitehead, 27 years old, born and raised nearby. He wasn't an outsider. He'd gone to the same schools as many of the partygoers' older siblings. Some knew him through mutual friends. Others had seen him before quiet, sometimes withdrawn, but always there on the edges of gatherings. That night, according to witnesses, he'd been drinking heavily. An argument started over a car, or maybe over a slight, no one could quite agree, but at some point he'd walked back to his vehicle, retrieved a handgun, and returned to the firelight. The crowd thought he was bluffing until the first shot. As chaos erupted, Whitehead fled into the dark. He drove away before deputies arrived. By morning, his description was everywhere: bulletin alerts, social media posts, news tickers reading, "Suspect at large after Pinson bonfire shooting." Detectives tracked his phone, pinged from a tower near his home. At 8:17 a.m., a SWAT team surrounded a small house just outside Blount County. The arrest was quiet. He stepped out without resistance, hands raised, eyes down. Inside his car, they found the gun, a .40 caliber handgun registered in his name. Ballistic testing would later confirm it matched the casings recovered from the pit. Sheriff's deputies booked him into the Jefferson County Jail on 4 counts of attempted murder. His mugshot would circulate across Alabama within hours, a blank stare, bloodshot eyes, no visible emotion. But when Kimber died 2 days later, those charges changed. Attempted murder became murder. The sheriff's department released a statement that afternoon. "The loss of this young life is a tragedy beyond measure. We are committed to seeing justice served." The town's grief turned quickly to anger. Candlelight vigils were held across Cleveland. Students wore pink bows to school. Teachers pinned ribbons to their doors, and local businesses donated food for Kimber's family. Outside the courthouse, signs appeared overnight. "Justice for Kimber." She was just 18. Reporters described the community as heartbroken, but united their sadness, tempered by determination. Meanwhile, Whitehead's name became the focus of every conversation. Who was he? Why was he there? What made him pull the trigger? Court records revealed a history of minor offenses, traffic violations, disorderly conduct, but nothing close to what had happened that night. Friends said he'd been struggling lately, drinking more, drifting from job to job. To outsiders, it looked like a senseless act. To those who lived there, it was something even harder to accept, that the man who had taken Kimber's life wasn't a stranger from somewhere far away. He was one of their own. As the case moved through the courts, the district attorney confirmed that the state would pursue the maximum penalty. Whitehead was denied bond. The hearing was brief. His eyes fixed on the table, Kimber's parents seated only a few feet away. Outside, her classmates gathered, holding candles in the cool October air. The same air that just days earlier had carried the smell of smoke and the sound of laughter. But now it carried something else, a silence that stretched through the town like fog. For the first time in decades, Cleveland felt unsafe. Not because a killer was on the loose, but because the illusion that tragedy only happens somewhere else had been shattered. Inside the intensive care unit of UAB Hospital, time no longer moved in minutes or hours. It moved in breaths, each one measured by the quiet rise and fall of Kimber's chest, a rhythm kept alive by machines. Nurses had grown attached to her in just 2 days. They called her the fighter. Even when the monitors flatlined for a moment, she found her way back. But on Tuesday morning, the fight began to fade. Doctors met the family in a small consultation room, away from the hum of machines. They spoke gently, explaining the scans, the swelling, the lack of brain activity. There was nothing more medicine could do. Her parents sat in silence. For them, hope had always been stronger than logic, until that moment. And then, through tears, her mother asked a question no one expected. Can she help someone else? Within minutes, the hospital's transplant team began preparations. Papers were signed. Tests were run. Kimber's organs were strong, healthy, capable of saving multiple lives. The news reached the hallways. Nurses who had never met her began to cry. A respiratory therapist whispered, "She's giving life while losing hers." By late afternoon, the hospital announced an honor walk. It's a quiet tradition when a donor's body is moved toward the operating room. Staff lined the hallways to pay respect. No words, just presence. As word spread, hundreds gathered. Doctors, security guards, janitors, students from the nursing program, people who had never known her but felt like they did. The elevator doors opened. Kimber lay beneath a pale pink blanket, her cheer bow still clipped to the side of her hair. A nurse adjusted it gently. The procession began. The hallway lights dimmed slightly, every head bowed. The only sound was the wheels of the stretcher and the faint echo of the heart monitor. Her parents walked beside her, hands intertwined. Her mother's whisper carried through the silence. "You're helping people now, baby. Just like you wanted." Step by step, they moved down the corridor lined with tear-streaked faces. Outside the operating room doors, the family stopped. The father kissed his daughter's forehead and said 4 words he'd whispered every night when she was little. "Good night, my sweet girl." The doors closed. Inside, the transplant team worked quickly, precisely. One by one, Kimber's organs were prepared for transport. Her heart was placed in a cooler marked for a children's hospital several states away, its recipient, a 7-year-old waiting for a second chance. Another patient received her kidneys. 2 more gained sight through her corneas. In less than 12 hours, 4 families would wake up with hope again. Outside UAB, the crowd remained. Pink ribbons fluttered from railings. Candles flickered in the wind. Reporters covering the vigil struggled to hold back tears. They weren't just documenting another tragedy. They were witnessing a town learning how to turn grief into grace. Later that night, as the hospital lights dimmed, a nurse placed a small note on Kimber's empty bed. It read, "Thank you for your final gift." Across Alabama, people who had never heard her name before began sharing it. #LiveLikeKimber trended online, a phrase born not from tragedy, but from the way she'd lived. For her family, the pain was still unbearable. Yet beneath it, something deeper began to take shape, the knowledge that even in her final moments, Kimber had changed the world around her. And for the little boy whose heartbeat now echoed with hers, that change was life itself. In the days after Kimber's honor walk, investigators returned to the clearing at the pit. The fire had long gone out, but the ground still bore its scars, a ring of ash, glass fragments, a single shoe half buried in the mud. For detectives, this was no longer just a scene. It was a story waiting to be read, frame by frame. Technicians photographed every footprint, mapped the spread of the shell casings, and collected soil samples darkened by gunpowder residue. Nearby they found the casing that matched the weapon recovered from Stephen Tyler Whitehead's car. Each small piece tied the night together. Phone data placed Whitehead's vehicle near the site, minutes before the first 911 call. Surveillance from a gas station 5 miles away captured his truck heading north at 11:08 p.m., exactly when witnesses said he fled. Detectives also pulled digital evidence texts exchanged earlier that day between partygoers, short videos uploaded to social media, fragments of laughter and shouting that would later help rebuild the timeline. One clip ended abruptly after a bright flash in the background. That flash became the final reference point for when the first bullet was fired. Interviews continued through the week. Some witnesses admitted they'd been too afraid to come forward at first. Others described seeing Whitehead pacing near the fire moments before the shooting. He'd argued with another man over something small, a misplaced drink, maybe an insult, then walked off toward his truck. Detectives believe that's when everything tipped. He loaded around, returned, and fired into the crowd without a clear target. By Thursday, the sheriff's office released its preliminary report. Evidence indicates the suspect acted alone. Alcohol was a contributing factor. The shooting appears to have been spontaneous and unprovoked. Still, investigators kept asking why. Whitehead's friends told reporters he'd been distant in the weeks before the bonfire, drinking more, quitting jobs, angry at the world, but at no one in particular. No manifesto, no plan, just an unraveling. Prosecutors gathered everything: ballistics, witness statements, phone records, and began preparing for grand jury review. At the courthouse, detectives carried thick folders through narrow halls. Reporters trailed behind, cameras flashing. But none of the investigators spoke. They didn't need to. The evidence would speak for them. One officer later said, "It's hard to call something like this a case. Cases end. But this is something the town will live with for a long time." Back in Cleveland, reminders of Kimber were everywhere: pink ribbons on telephone poles, her locker still decorated with photos and notes. For detectives, those reminders mattered too. They weren't just working for a file number. They were working for a girl who had once laughed around a fire. By early November, the district attorney announced the formal indictment. 1 count of murder, 3 counts of attempted murder, and possession of a firearm during a violent crime. Whitehead pleaded not guilty. His attorney cited confusion, intoxication, fear, anything to slow the tide of anger that had risen since that night. But for Kimber's family, there was no confusion. They called it what it was: a choice. The investigation had done its part. Now the weight of justice moved to the courtroom. On a gray November morning, the courthouse in Jefferson County filled long before the doors opened. Reporters lined the steps. Classmates stood together in silence, clutching pink ribbons. Kimber's parents walked through the crowd hand in hand, their faces calm, but their eyes carrying months of sleepless nights. Inside, the courtroom was small, unchanged from decades past. Oak paneling, the state seal hanging slightly off-center behind the judge's bench. It smelled of old paper and polish, a place built for rules, not for heartbreak. At 9:02 a.m., Stephen Tyler Whitehead was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit and shackles at his ankles. He didn't look up. Reporters scribbled as the judge read the charges: 1 count of murder, 3 counts of attempted murder, possession of a firearm during a violent crime. Each count was followed by the same answer: not guilty. The families of the other victims sat behind Kimber's parents, each holding framed photos of their children, each waiting for a justice that words could never fully deliver. The prosecution opened with the story the community already knew: a Saturday night bonfire, a crowd of teenagers, 4 lives changed forever. They played the cell phone clip recovered from that night. The courtroom fell silent as the crack of gunfire echoed through the speakers. Jurors flinched. Then came the photos, the clearing, the casings, the path Kimber's body took through the woods to the waiting ambulance. The lead detective described the evidence in measured tones. Ballistic matches, molars, fingerprints on the gun, residue on Whitehead's hands. When the defense took its turn, the argument shifted. They called it confusion, an accident made worse by alcohol and panic. Whitehead himself never testified. He sat motionless, eyes fixed on the floor, while lawyers spoke about his upbringing, his struggles, his regrets. Kimber's mother never looked away. At one point, the prosecutor held up a photograph Kimber in her cheer uniform, sunlight across her face, and said softly, "This is who this case is about. Not statistics, not excuses. A daughter." The jury listened for 6 days. They heard from paramedics, friends, and the surgeon who tried to save her. They saw the footage of the honor walk. Some jurors wept quietly. On the final morning, closing arguments filled the room. The prosecutor's voice steady, deliberate. Every choice has a consequence. He chose to drink. He chose to carry a weapon. He chose to pull the trigger. The defense countered with a plea for mercy, a life already destroyed, they said. By afternoon, the jury retired to deliberate. Outside, the crowd waited in the cold, bundled in blankets, candles flickering even in daylight. Reporters whispered updates through microphones. Inside, minutes stretched into hours. At 7:13 p.m., the bailiff re-entered the courtroom. The jury had reached a verdict. People stood as the foreperson handed the paper to the judge. The room held its breath. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder." A sob broke somewhere in the back. Kimber's mother covered her mouth. Her father lowered his head. Whitehead stared straight ahead, expression blank. The judge thanked the jury and scheduled sentencing for the following month. Outside, cameras flashed again, but this time the voices were quieter, no shouting, no chaos. Just the sound of relief, mixed with sorrow. One reporter described the moment best. Justice was served, but the air still felt heavy because justice can never replace a heartbeat. The following week, the courtroom benches emptied. The trial was over. The headlines faded. But in Cleveland, the ribbons stayed. They stayed on mailboxes, around trees, tied to fences. A reminder not of the verdict, but of the girl whose kindness became her legacy. When the gavel struck for the last time, Cleveland didn't celebrate. There were no cheers, no crowds outside the courthouse. Just a collective exhale, the kind that comes after months of holding your breath. The story that began with a bonfire ended here, in the same quiet town where Kimber had grown up. But endings, like grief, rarely stay in one place. In the weeks after the verdict, life began to move again. The leaves changed, classrooms filled, and football games returned. Yet nothing looked quite the same. Her locker remained untouched, pink ribbons still taped to the door, the inside covered with notes from friends. "We miss you. Fly high, Kimber." At graduation, the school left an empty chair draped with her uniform. Her name was read aloud. The gym fell silent, every head bowed. Her parents accepted the diploma on her behalf, hands trembling as the crowd stood in a quiet ovation. Outside, sunlight spilled across the field where she'd once cheered. The breeze caught the ribbons tied to the fence, making them dance like small, restless flames. Around town, her story became more than tragedy. Local businesses hung framed photos of her smile. The county council passed a resolution establishing the Kimber Mills Memorial Scholarship, awarded each year to a student pursuing nursing. At the hospital in Birmingham, a plaque was mounted near the transplant wing. In honor of Kimber Mills, whose final act gave others a chance at life. One of those lives was a little boy, 7 years old. In December, his parents wrote a letter to Kimber's family through the donor network. It said only this: "Every beat of our son's heart is a thank you we can never fully say." Her parents framed that letter and placed it beside her senior portrait. They said it helps them breathe on the hard days. Reporters stopped coming. Cameras moved on. But for Cleveland, the memory remained woven into the rhythm of the town, in the sound of Friday night cheers, in the laughter that still echoes down the high school halls, in the small gestures of kindness that people now call simply living like Kimber. Because her story isn't only about loss, it's about what comes after, how a community can be broken and still choose compassion, how one life can end and still create countless new beginnings. And somewhere, in a children's hospital miles away, a little heart still beats with hers. Each pulse is a reminder, even in the darkest moments, there's a way to leave light behind. She was just 18. The tragic story of Kimber Mills. In loving memory of Kimber Mills, 2007-2025. Live like Kimber.